Hello and welcome to this Wired virtual briefing. I'm Oliver Franklin Wallis, a contributing editor at Wired. Today's session is about an industry that is right now going under more change than any other in the world economy. It is healthcare. The healthcare industry has seen a huge and rapid period of change over the last decade that's been thrown into a period of unprecedented, accelerated change by the coronavirus pandemic that's affecting all of our lives. Today we're going to be talking about some of those changes, and I'm thrilled to be joined by Pamela Spence, who is a global health sciences and wellness industry leader at EY, the global professional services firm. Pamela works closely with some of the leading companies in world healthcare and has first-hand experience of how the pandemic and how technological changes are really changing the way that we interact with healthcare and changing the landscape of the industry. Her team has recently put out a new report into the trends that they see driving that change over the coming decade. We're talking about things like artificial intelligence, the role of new sensors coming onto the market, 5G, the explosion of healthcare data, to give us a sense of what healthcare might look like in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, or at the very least when this is all over. Pamela, welcome. It's great to have you with us here today.
Well, thanks, Ollie, for having me this morning. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So first of all, you began working on this report long before the coronavirus outbreak. How's it changed the way that you're thinking about the future of the healthcare industry?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, fundamentally, the issues in the healthcare industry haven't changed. I think what I'm excited about, I think I'm most optimistic about, is whilst the coronavirus crisis, as awful as it is, what it has done, though, is show the industry that virtual ways of working can work. And virtual ways of working and telemedicine are actually acceptable to stakeholders, be it the physicians or the patients. And whilst most of the virtual healthcare delivery has, of course, been in the COVID space, because that has been the crisis point and the need to socially distance, but also the need to actually deliver care to those who need it and when. It has actually taught us a lesson that telemedicine, virtual ways of working, the use of technology, we've all seen the pictures in the media, but the use of technology can actually really make a difference. So I think that has been a sticking point really for industry stakeholders. Will it, won't it be acceptable? And I think that we've proved in the corona crisis that actually it is acceptable, and therefore I'm quite optimistic about the lessons that we can learn from this awful crisis going forward, and how healthcare more broadly is going to be, I hope, more willing to adopt technology, because of course there's some fantastic technological developments out there now.
Do you feel like this, I've seen some of the figures coming out about people doing video GP appointments, for example. The numbers are up to the roof. We've seen some of the growth in remote testing, people collecting their prescriptions remotely, and these kind of things. So there's obviously a huge acceleration in the ways that people are behaving. But we also have the associated challenges with the economics facing the economic impact, both more broadly and on the industry itself. How much do those kind of economic shocks play into how you're feeling about the next few years and the next decade?
Well, I mean, clearly there is an economic impact here, but I think technology, ultimately lowers the cost of healthcare, and it enables better access at a lower price point, and ultimately is going to be more affordable to those. And I also think, for many years there's been lots of modeling. If people could actually use technology more effectively, then actually for those instances when technology and virtual, you mentioned going to your GP, but virtual ways of working are not appropriate, and actually a physical examination or action is needed, I think we'll see that if people are willing to adopt virtual, which they have proved they are, then I think we'll see actually the physical interactions being much more easy to actually access and get. And I think then the cost of healthcare more broadly will ultimately be lower. So I think this is a tremendous opportunity for us to think about how we can start doing things differently, rather than just going back to the normal ways of working that we perhaps might have adopted in the past. And I think particularly is there's some really interesting aspects around people's behaviour, but also the willingness of people to actually monitor their own health themselves. And I think we'll see more of that coming in, particularly as sensors become more sophisticated. I'm really quite excited at some of the technological advancements in sensors, but also equally importantly, 5G. I mean, that's not really here yet, but 5G has an incredible ability to transmit a significant amounts of data of which we've not really seen before. So the linking between sensors, people's behavior, 5G, and then of course we've got these AI engines that can actually then analyze a lot of data. I think that we'll see a real uptake in adoption of those practices, because ultimately healthcare is more effective when it's very personalized to us as individuals. And the more we can do and the more we can use technology to personalize those experiences, and ultimately the personal benefit that we can get, because then we can make sure that we're getting a more tailored treatment for us and how our individual bodies work, because we don't all work the same. I think that's a great opportunity as well.
The behaviour point, I think, is really interesting, and you go into this in some depth in the report, but there's been this school of thought around for a long time. It's not new that healthy behaviour results in healthy outcomes. And particularly when it comes to technology, there are companies that have used apps or other digital intervention to try and encourage healthy behaviours. But they've seen some, they've shown some results in scientific studies, but have yet to gain any widespread major traction. The coronavirus crisis, if anything, has shown us through social distancing and other, the success of hand washing, that widespread behaviour change can have significant impacts on public health. Why do you think those existing behavioural change efforts have so far struggled? And do you see that this crisis as kind of moving the Overton window, as it were, and hopefully changing the landscape for some of those other approaches?
Yeah, I mean, behaviour is a science in itself, of course, and quite complicated. I think that you touched on a number of different factors. I think why, I think governments generally are astonished at the high levels of compliance or adoption that the populations in their countries have actually done in terms of social distancing, adherence to the various different guidance. But I think the fundamental important point there is there was a consequence of not doing it. Either it was a moral one, I want to do my bit for society and we're all in this together at the same time. So there's a sort of herd mentality there. Or of course, if individuals really did overtly flout the guidance, there were, perhaps fines or custodial consequences. Depending, of course, on the geography. So I think that's one aspect. I think, though, more generally in healthcare, behaviour has been quite difficult to really take effect for two reasons. One, it links back to what I just said. There was no real immediate feedback loop or consequence, and secondly, the interface with the patient and ultimately the individual who's most in control of their behaviour, we forget that design and experience are critical in terms of designing an interaction. And so what we've typically had in the past is scientists looking at human behaviour and the logic of why somebody would want to do something, but not actually giving them a quick feedback loop on how they were progressing, and actually making it fun, making it user-friendly, and actually making the experience something that somebody wanted to do. And it always struck me, there was a very good example of a company I was talking to probably now 18 months ago, and they had designed something really quite clever, but using behavioral science at its core. And it was an app for chronic disease, managing a chronic disease. But they had actually managed to get real results. But when you talk to the engineers and the CEO of the company, they had their first prototype and they actually took it to one of the more well-known tech companies who really is experienced in design, and to say, well, what do you think? And as a result of that conversation, they threw out 2/3 of their prototype because they reckoned, they realized it was rather wooden. in how it was used. There was no design thinking in it, and there was also no real experience for the user. So they ditched 2/3 of what they had, and then they put a third in for design and a third in for how the user would experience, and they got some tremendous results. So I think that really brings it home that you really need to collaborate with people who might not have the same skills as you to make something that's going to be really effective for, as in this case, was the end user, the patient.
And it's interesting that you are starting to really see those outcomes, and as we were saying, we may now see a more openness to more willingness to try this in different fields, and
Definitely.
alongside the adoption of those digital approaches. Something that came up in the report that I was absolutely fascinated by. I'm going to read this data point. In 2018, the healthcare sector generated an estimated 1.18 exabytes of data. 1,218 exabytes of data, 100 times more than all the data humankind generated in its history up to the year 2000. How is the industry going about managing that explosion in healthcare data?
I'm not sure the industry is managing it that well. I mean, I think that you also look at the predicted growth rate. You know, now we have the benefit of much lower costs of genome mapping. You have many people wanting to contribute to healthcare because either they feel morally wanting to, or commercially they find it attractive. So I think the whole management of data, and I think alongside the statistic in our report, we quote, I think 3.2% of carbon emissions are going to come from data storage, in the healthcare data storage in the future. And I think that sort of puts it into perspective. But we are generating an awful lot of data, really because technology and it is becoming more mature, and sensors are being able to capture, of course, what's going inside our bodies, and again to personalize that experience. So I think that, but the issue, I think, is not how much data there is, because you can have loads and loads of data, but if you don't actually understand what you want that data to help you with, then you're not going to be able to use that data effectively. The AI engines that could possibly interrogate that data for value are not going to be as well thought through as they might. And then the insights, therefore, you're going to get out of the data are not going to be as beneficial as they might. So I think I say to many clients that really think through, do you really want to own data, or do you want to have access to data? You really want access to data to be able to interrogate, but are you really clear what you want to interrogate? And a lot of people at the moment are thinking, I just need access to data. So I think that's a really important point. I think, storage capacity, we will work out how servers are more sustainably friendly. We will work out the capacity, storage cost. We will work all that out. But we really need to be clear about what data we're keen on keeping and why we're keen on keeping it. And I think that is the real test for people at the moment, is what data do you really want? And another example of that would be, I'm not really sure it's going to be beneficial to anybody actually knowing what my healthcare status was 20 years ago, or even 5 years ago. What really matters to me, if I get sick tomorrow, is what is my body doing today? What was it doing yesterday? What is it doing tomorrow, the day that I get sick? And more importantly, how does it respond in the few days after that? And so I do think that we're going to start switching to, rather than historical longitudinal data set, we're going to start thinking about how can I actually understand what's going on with Pamela's body today in some detail, and then benchmarking that again in a very specific way against data banks of very specific data points. So I think that then unleashes a whole raft of opportunity, and we get over the struggle of wanting to interrogate historical health records, which of course, as we all know, are very, very fragmented. But that only works if we have sophisticated sensors that actually are reading what's going on inside me, as well as reading my vital signs in some degree of detail.
It's interesting that I think we've seen through the coronavirus epidemic, when there's a sudden public health need to, you see immense collaboration at speed within the scientific community, and people putting up these data sets, and even from historically closed off places, and we have that in the short term, and it's great to see. How do you create and you go into this a little bit in the report, how do you create the business models to maintain that level of collaboration to enable these new use cases? Because otherwise you kind of go back to a model where we're having data sets being siloed off and people just not being able to get access, and particularly not being able to get access if you don't have the financial clout to, as you say, be a data owner, and just when you just want access to that data.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the best way to describe that is, I mean, it has been tremendous to see the degrees of international collaboration and national collaborations. But again, there's been a collaboration for a very specific purpose. And that, I think, is the most important point. You're collaborating with a clear goal, a clearly defined goal. And you know what you're each contributing, and that's very clearly set out. I think what hinders collaboration models is when you think, oh, let's get together, let's collaborate. To do what? There's no real clear defined goal. And of course, some organizations are very philanthropic, but even the not-for-profits, they still have a commercial model to operate. And of course, the commercial sector, they all have investors that or certainly in the commercial sector want to return. And I think the problems are in collaboration, you have to be really specific on what you are collaborating for and what each party is bringing. If you're clear on that, it's very easy to collaborate. I think what has hindered us in the past is, are we really clear? No, we're not. And then if you're not clear, then you are not going to be clear on how to share any IP that you agree could have a commercial value. So I think the key is be really clear on your goal and why you're collaborating and what each party is bringing.
Something you mentioned as well in the report is so much of when we're talking about data and people's concerns, you mentioned there about the historical health records, people are concerned about privacy and security of their data. You mentioned in the report that we've seen an increase in cybersecurity attacks on healthcare databases. We've seen reports of this coming out more recently. How are you seeing your clients react and trying to prevent that from happening? And do you see that being an escalating risk as this masses of data, as we talked about, are going online?
Interesting. And I mean, the very early signs once we started in this coronavirus crisis was that the cyber attacks on certainly the major biopharmaceutical companies had increased. I'm not saying they were successful attacks. I would say they were, they were attacks. And I think that's actually a sad fact of human nature, and that people wanted to get an edge, and that the reason that we believe the attacks were made was because people wanted to get an edge into who might be developing the most effective therapeutic, or who had the edge in terms of a vaccine development. Why? Really, so somebody could actually make a financial gain, which is, it's quite sad given the actual crisis that we're in globally. But I do want to emphasize, they were attempted attacks. They weren't necessarily successful attacks, and I of course haven't got all the data on what may have been successful and what wasn't. What we did see definitely was an increase in attempts, and obviously cyber is a sophisticated area, and as more data is out there, people will want to understand what's actually in the data who shouldn't have access to it. So I do think that cyber will be an increased threat to us all as we become more technology dependent and data centric. But on the other hand, I do think that the advances in cyber are also increasing. And so I do say to people, please don't concern yourself too much about cyber attacks. Of course, we have to spend appropriately and mitigate those risks as best as we can. But I don't believe concerns around privacy and the risk of cyber should slow down the advancement in science, and also the opportunity that we have in front of us for better healthcare that's more accessible and affordable to all through really data-driven technology technology models. So I think my encouragement was for people, there was an awful lot of clever cyber people who can help mitigate your risks. But please, I wouldn't see that necessarily as a stopping point for how we can actually move forward in the healthcare agenda.
I wanted to touch upon something that you've mentioned a couple of times so far, which is the sudden explosion in the availability of sensors and continuous monitoring. You know, it's been fascinating to me looking through the news reports, and you see cases of people who are daily, you know, coronavirus patients who are from home reporting their blood oxygenation to their doctors through wearable devices. You've also in the past talked to me about some of the things that you kind of see out there in development and at trade shows and things, because you get access to the kind of the cutting edge in this industry. When you talk about continuous monitoring and you talk about the benefits that and 5G are going to bring, what are the kind of things that you mean? What are the sensors that you see in the near term and both further out, making a real difference to our lives?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's the sorts of vital signs monitoring. I would say you can do them with sensors that are actually outside of your body, on your body, outside. I think the really exciting stuff is actually the in-body sensors. So, there are some medicines now that actually have a component that actually measures how your body is metabolizing the medicine, with a view, therefore, how effective that medicine actually is for you individually, because we all are different inside or outside as well as inside. But actually then, and that can actually then transmit data, that medicine, to a sensor on the outside of the body. But it's that degree of personalization and sophistication that I think is really important, to actually measure how effective a treatment is for me inside my body, that might therefore be a predeterminant before I had any other symptoms of any degree disease progression. I think that's really exciting. I think there's also some really smart dust, it's called, that actually you can have inside your body, again taken with a medicine, that actually, depending on how sick you are, you can turn on and off the dosages of medicine with UV light. So, those, I mean, these are all, they're not mainstream yet, but these are the sorts of tiny micro adjustments, because our body is full of micro processes that can really make a difference. So it's those sorts of inside your body sensors, especially when you're really sick. I think we'll start to see an explosion of that. Again, people have to be comfortable, but again, people are comfortable taking the medicines that are prescribed to them in the main today, and why should that be any different?
A lot of what we've seen so far in the kind of version 1 of some of these on-the-body sensors are dealing with chronic diseases, diabetes, heart disease, and those kind of things. Do you see these new sensors, as they come online, changing the business models, as it were, changing the kind of conditions that these sensors are able to help us diagnose and prevent in a lot of ways? So a lot of what you're talking about is actually lifestyle management, prevention of onset of disease and detection, as well as managing existing chronic conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I think many chronic conditions lend themselves to self-monitoring, and that touches on the behavioural science aspect that we mentioned before. I think there's an awful lot that actually that we can do in some of these less chronic, more acute conditions. But I think the technology there is slightly different. I mean, something I'm really optimistic about, and it's early stages, is some of the cell and gene therapies. The CAR T therapies, I mean, pretty horrible to be suffering from liquid tumors, but there are now, with cell and gene therapies, opportunity, and it's still in its relatively early stages of trials, but also some CAR T therapies are now commercially available that actually cure, rather than, and I think cure is rather than just treat. And I think that, though, the technology that has to happen to actually what happens in these CAR T therapies, you actually take a tissue sample, blood sample, the cells are actually, your cells are actually changed, and your cells are then put back in you to help you fight the disease. That's another very interesting area of where technology can really play its part in curing. And I think we'll see more of that. Now, you know, these are horrible diseases. The treatments also are pretty horrible as well. But if there's an opportunity to cure, that has tremendous benefit to society, of course, because the person can be cured. They don't have any ongoing healthcare costs, and they can, you know, resume to be productive members of society.
A big part of, we've talked a little bit about this with regard to security, but we're dealing with massive amounts of data in a lot of cases, very personalised data coming in real time. A lot of the report talks about trust. And you mentioned AI earlier. AI is obviously a fascinating subject for us here at Wired, and obviously there's a huge amount of innovation going on across the industry in this area, whether it's, you know, drug discovery or whether it's detection, diagnostics, all kinds of areas. Something you mentioned is a little bit about the way that regulators are thinking about trust in the age of AI. Can you tell us a little bit about how you feel like the acceleration of these technologies is changing the way that regulation is going to work? You know, AI is a great example of that.
Yeah, sure, and you can see the statistics in our report in terms of the number of AI approved treatments is, I wouldn't say exponential, but it's clearly not a linear graph. It's definitely increasing and increasing at speed. And I think that's because, you know, the regulators are now more accepting, because there's more, there is more evidence now that AI can be really helpful. Now, of course, the regulators have a huge job and an important job to regulate the industry with a view that, you know, to keep us safe. But I actually think now we can see the evidence coming through from the AI. You know, at its base level, you know, technology and you know, computer algorithms are just ones and noughts. They're not emotional. You know, my eyes, if I'm reading, I don't know, say an X-ray, and I'm looking at, you know, 80 or 90 X-rays a day of different people, my eyes might get a bit tired. But the AI doesn't get tired. The small differences that can actually be got from, you know, sonographic data now, I think are incredible, and at much higher resolution than the human eye. So you're looking at scans, you're looking at X-rays, and I think we've seen tremendous progress in those areas. We've also seen tremendous progress in terms of diseases such as sepsis, which can take hold really rapidly, and, you know, really different symptoms, and actually comparing somebody's symptoms and looking at how they are progressing, again with the use of sensors to measure really small changes. We've now got lots of evidence that actually sepsis can be diagnosed much more quickly. And the astonishing fact, you know, that every hour that a sepsis is diagnosed significantly increases the prognosis. So, and you know, the survival rate of the patient. So I think that's a really good marry up of, you know, but AI is now giving us the evidence. So therefore we are generating more trust, and we're beginning to understand through lots of trial and error about the beauty that actually a really sophisticated device that is unemotional, doesn't get tired, can really read from these small changes in data with a view that, you know, many more people can be saved.
And one of the things you talk about is this idea of how regulators can react to this field that's moving so quickly. And for example, the US Federal Drug Administration, the FDA, had previously been operating on a model where they would have to essentially look at closed off algorithms that have been trained on a fixed data set and then deployed. And something you cover in the report is this proposal to change the way that they're working so that there will actually be approving developers, as it were, or companies, producers of these algorithms based on a set of, you know, a set of existing metrics rather than the algorithms itself. How do you see that playing out, and what do you see the repercussions of that being?
Well, I mean, I'm forever the optimist. I mean, I think the regulators, you know, in all areas of the world, I would observe over the last 18 months, 24 months, they have a huge appetite to learn more and collaborate with the industry. So I think that's a massive plus. And I think actually, you know, the advancements are only going to be as good as they can be if they're regulatory approved. So I see that collaboration between the regulator and the innovators much more strongly. And I think, you know, you've just said, you know, there's going to be more advanced ways of these algorithms coming to market. And I think that, you know, one doesn't know until the regulator approves or not, of course. But I think the degrees of collaboration that we're seeing is only going to be for the betterment.
The biggest change, I think, the thing that's going to happen most profoundly that you talk about in this report is, you know, the industry was already under economic pressures before the coronavirus outbreak, and in a lot of ways this hasn't changed things so much as kind of made them arrive sooner. And you talk about the massive business challenges facing, whether that's big pharma or startups, and you identify 4 key business models for you kind of these 4 different pathways for the future of healthcare companies and healthcare startups. Can you talk a little bit about those business models, why you see them, that specialization is going to be increasingly important, and what you think those knock-on effects will be?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the business models that you refer to, we're talking about, you know, does a company or an organization want to be a breakthrough innovator, really innovate the cutting edge of new stuff? Does somebody actually perhaps want to not be famous for product innovation, but actually be famous for service delivery? And that's a completely different skill. We would split the service delivery into 2 areas. One is, we call it a disease manager, and one is a lifestyle manager. So, you know, how do you keep yourself healthy for the lifestyle manager, and how do you keep yourself, how do you optimize the treatment for somebody with a condition, a disease manager? And then you've got the efficient producers who actually take innovation and after the requisite patent expiry, actually optimize processes to produce stuff or deliver stuff more cheaply. And what we're saying in the report, and we've spoken about these business models for the last 2 years, we don't believe that an individual organization can be excellent in more than one of those. And we say that because it's expensive. To your point, you know, the industry is not overwhelmed with capital. It can be expensive to operate in more than one of those. But we would argue that it's not just the expense, it's actually the skills you need to operate in each of those are different. And more importantly, as we advance down the data and technology agenda, the data sets that you actually need either ownership of or more importantly, as I mentioned before, access to, are also different. So, you know, an organization can really choose, does it want to be excellent and create real value for customers and be competitively distinct at an overall lower cost of capital? Or do you actually want to play across business models, which we believe will be ultimately more expensive? And because you're not specializing, you're not going to be, we believe, as competitively distinct and offer better products or services as others who do specialize, because the changes are going to start being more and more stark. And I won't go into now, but the data, the more you look into it, the different data sets and the different skills are going to, you know, really start to delineate. So I would encourage, you know, all organizations in the healthcare sector to really think through, which business model do I really want to be? And then, you know, how do I actually transform to really focus on just doing that?
I think that's a really key learning, both for the established players who may need to go through some period of consolidation, but also startups need to be thinking about this in an early stage. You know, they may have something that they've shown efficacy for in a lab, or they may have a, you know, design product. But I think that's a pretty key thing, that it's very difficult to pivot difficult and expensive to pivot later on. So this is something that you'd advise that startups be thinking about as well.
Definitely.
What does that mean in terms of the big players for the ways that they're working and thinking about the industry? How does one how does one change direction, as it were, if you're previously playing in multiple of these verticals? What does that mean for those companies?
I think we see when we started talking about this 2 years ago, I didn't see so much divestitures and collaborations to really hone specific skills in one area, but we have seen quite a lot of movement from big players, typically those who are operating across business models, for sure. I still think there's a tremendous way to go. And the reason that has been driven, both in terms of a provider setting, but also in a biopharma or medical device setting, people are beginning to recognize it's expensive. And so I think that there is recognition that journey has started. I still think, though, the model has been in the past, well, if I have a diverse portfolio of offerings, therefore I'm going to be less exposed to risk, volatility in my business, and therefore I can be better predict have access to the capital that I need to further my operations. But that's not going to play out for forever, and to be really excellent, because of the investments that's needed, the capital that's needed to put into technology to really drive things to that. Again, the high degrees of personalization that we as consumers will ultimately, if some of us are demanding it already, but ultimately everyone will be demanding it. It's just too expensive to do more than one.
This world of personalized medicine, we're at a very early stage in this now. You mentioned some of the gene therapies and CAR-T and things, which are tremendously expensive, but offer us kind of a tantalizing glimpse of what treatments might be like in 20 years' time. And we've seen that the digitization going on at the moment. For ordinary people going to the doctors, how will life look different in, say, 2030 than it does today? What are the big changes that you're going to we're really going to see on the kind of consumer end?
That's a hard question, because that's 10 years away, and I think we always overestimate the progress that we're going to make in the next 18 months, 2 years, and always underestimate the impact of 10 years time. I don't know. I mean, this is pure speculation and it's a bit of fun. I can well believe that I would rarely see a physician face to face. I could, even if I went into a hospital or a secondary care facility, I would believe that, I would probably have a lot of robotic intervention. I think that the role of the physician will massively change. They will be there in the background, but they will be leveraged by technology hugely. I think that I think that whatever smartphone device or whatever that ends up to be, that will actually be very much personalized to me. I'll probably have a couple of sensors inside me that alert me that I'm looking to get sick in 48 hours before I really recognize it. So I think that the prevent will be a big element as well, but that will be really driven to go to the business model of the lifestyle manager that integrates with the vital signs that are collected in sensors from us. I would be very optimistic that cell and gene therapy is at a massively different place in 10 years. And so that we will be able to cure. So I think medicine will move towards prevent and cure rather than manage and treat. And I would hope by 2030 that would definitely be a reality. Now, will that mean I live till I'm 140 because I keep being cured of everything? I couldn't tell you. I'm really not sure. And that, of course, brings a whole different set of challenges, what I do with all those extra years, which is a completely different topic, of course. But But I think, you know, not to be too flippant, I think that we will become much more in control of our healthcare. I think our devices will be so personalized to us that we will be able to take precautionary and preventative measures before we get sick. And I also think that that cell and gene therapy area is going to be massive. And, you know, as started life as a scientist, that's, I do hope I see some of that in the near future.
Thanks so much for joining us. It's been a fascinating conversation. If you're interested, I really do recommend that you read EY's new report. It's called 5 Trends Driving the Emergence of the Personalised Health Ecosystem. We'll put a link in the article below and on YouTube. Pamela, I hope you're staying well. I hope everything healthy at home. And we'll see you next time. Thanks everyone for watching.
Thank you.